Mobile workforces, cloud applications, and digitalization are changing every aspect of the modern enterprise. And with radical transformation come new business risks. Welcome to Hybrid Identity Protection, the premier podcast for cybersecurity pros charged with defending hybrid identity environments. Presented by Semperis, the pioneer of identity-driven cyber resilience for the hybrid enterprise. And now, here's your host, 15-time Microsoft MVP and Active Directory security expert, Sean Deuby.
Okay, so my guest today is Lance Peterman. I've had a chance to meet and spend some time with Lance, actually back from when it was still called the Cloud Identity Summit, I think, here in New Orleans, where we're actually in an unusual event space here in New Orleans. You can't see this, of course, but we're in this, what looks like a giant outdoor with trees and pillars and interesting kinds of background noise. So you're here. So we're actually live on premises, and Lance and I met. Actually, I remember our conversations. The thing that is just outside the space we're in now, which is the Natchez Riverboat, going up and down the Mississippi River in the riverboat. So thanks for spending a few minutes with me, Lance.
Glad to be here.
So tell me, what are you doing now? You do two roles, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
I do. So my day job, the reason I'm here, is I lead the identity program at Dick's Sporting Goods now. I've been there for just about a year. Prior to that, I spent a little bit of time at Equitable, which is a financial services company. And then prior to that, I spent almost 11 years at Merck.
Right, okay. And sort of the goal of this podcast, there's the understanding of what the Russian cyber weapon NotPetya did to the shipping company Merck is pretty well known. But what is not quite so well known is that it's believed that Merck pharmaceutical suffered a much more extensive, more expensive collateral damage as a result of the NotPetya attack. So tell us a little bit about Merck. What does it do? How big is it? That sort of thing.
Sure. So some of my information on this is going to be dated, admittedly, because I've been gone for about 5 years now. But it's a company roughly about 50,000 employees globally. They are in the pharmaceutical industry, life-saving therapies, things like that. One of the things I'm always proud of is when I was there, they came out with their first treatment for melanoma that helped extend the life of many people, but most notably for me, President Jimmy Carter. He was given a very short message from his doctor to say, basically, put your affairs in order. And the product wasn't even publicly available yet, but they gave him an exception that is not uncommon, and it saved his life, literally. And he went back to building houses for Habitat for Humanity.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a fantastic experience there. Great company, great people. I was part of their cybersecurity area. Was one of their security architects, focusing mostly on identity and access management.
Right. So you were deep into identity there as well.
Yes.
So how would you describe the security environment at Merck at the time?
At the time, we had external evaluations compared to our peers, and we were relatively mature in comparison to them. Where we were lagging a little bit was in terms of funding and resources. Our CISO at the time, and he's still the CISO today, Terry Rice, made a pitch to the board. This was pre-attack, to try and level the field a little bit. And we made some investments, but they had almost no time to bear fruit before the attack happened. So I would say overall, especially from an identity standpoint, we were very mature from your classic identity use cases, your joiners, your movers, your leavers. Movers was probably not as robust, but every organization struggles with those. Privileged access was one of my areas of focus. And we were about 2 years into our PAM program when the attack happened. We had made good strides on it, and there's actually a fun aspect of that story, which I'll tell in a second. But So I would say overall, Merck, pharma, because it's a heavily regulated company, had requirements that allowed us to invest and have a level of maturity that smaller companies don't have that.
You mentioned your privileged access functions. Did you have any kind of administrative tiering set up in the environment? Do you know?
No. One of the biggest reasons why the attack was as impactful as it was, we were very flat from a directory perspective. And I can say all of these things now because I know that they've changed in exponential ways since I left, so I'm not revealing any OPSEC secrets. Don't want to make any of my friends at Merck mad at me. So
Right. This is more relating history than anything else.
Exactly.
So can you relate the events of the day from your viewpoint?
I can.
What it was like for you?
Quite vividly. It was June 27th, 2017. I know it's the 27th because it was 2 days after my birthday. I had just come back from my Identiverse, or it was still a Cloud Identity Summit at that point in Chicago, where I was super excited because I was asked to be an inaugural member of the board of directors for CIDPRO. And so I was in a pretty good mood at that point. And then that morning, I was actually traveling. We were meeting with one of our vendors, and one of my colleagues looked at me, and I could see on his face immediately that something was wrong. And he said, "We have a problem." And he went through and told me kind of what they knew at that point. And this was 8 o'clock in the morning that day. So at that point, the payload had delivered about, I would say, 6 hours prior. So we had signs up on all of the doors in our facilities across the world, but particularly the U.S. If there was a lucky part of this, and you can't see it, but I'm using lucky in scare quotes, because it happened so much earlier, most of our workforce that was in the United States wasn't on site yet. So they hadn't plugged into the network. So we managed to avoid some damage in that respect. But that's about as far as the lucky part got. So we found that out. I really didn't shift course. I reached out to my boss and said, is there anything I can do? And he's like, no, we're in recovery at this point. So I finished the day. Next day, flew back to Charlotte. Again, was looking around, feeling like that helpless, guy walking around. I'm a big fan of Pulp Fiction, so that meme of Vincent standing around in the living room, kind of looking around, is kind of what I felt like. And at that point, I went back to where they were starting to basically build new laptops. And so here's this seasoned identity professional with 20 years of IT experience, and I'm building laptops. And
I was going to ask about that. It's like, here so you can help.
And the funny thing was I actually found some joy in that, because it was like, there's something I can do. So I was not on the front lines of that. At that point, we had brought in an incident team that was helping coordinate and the good news was Merck had a very mature business continuity and disaster response plan. And a lot of that just kicked off. Now, something of this magnitude and imagination was not something we had ever anticipated. Nobody had. But in basically the statistics that we got was basically in about 90 seconds, we had lost 15,000 Windows servers and workstations.
90 seconds.
90 seconds. And so it was devastating. I mean, the official financial numbers that were posted, especially when we filed our insurance claim, which is almost a podcast into itself, was over $800 million. So it became the most expensive cyber attack in history.
Did you have any insight into the rebuilding of Active Directory or the impact to Active Directory?
I did have some. So Active Directory was not owned by the identity area. And that's pretty common. That was infrastructure.
Right.
The good news was, we had both good backups, which we test pretty regularly, and we had the right tools to do it. But you still have time as your biggest enemy. So it took us about, and some of these numbers are in the memory hole, but. I want to say it took us about 24 to 48 hours. We had our first DC back up and running. We had to make sure it was stable, that it was untouched by NotPetya. At that point, things were able to progress, but it was the overall recovery effort. It was about 3 months total of, and when I say recovery, it's like obviously within a week we had like our office productivity back up and people were able to communicate and all that stuff. But getting applications back up takes time.
Right, and it's a serial process. You have to have fundamental infrastructure in place before you can start bringing the applications back.
Absolutely.
What are your perceptions of the vulnerabilities that NotPetya took advantage of in the Merck environment at the time?
Sure. And that was one of the most frustrating aspects of it, because at the time I was a very active Twitter user, and of course with lots of time on my hands while the attack, there were still smoldering ashes, so to speak. I was on Twitter, and of course people were like, why didn't they patch and whatnot? It's like, this wasn't a patching issue. So some of the key things that were exploited, the biggest one was, at the time, Microsoft's Credential Guard was still a very new product. In fact, I don't even know if it was GA at that point. A modified version of the Mimikatz payload was really what did the most damage. As I understand it from the report, obviously the attack originated in Ukraine. Somebody walked into our Ukraine office, which, as I understand it, was a very small office. They powered up their machine, and there was a software product called Me.Doc that's basically the Ukrainian equivalent of QuickBooks, so that we could pay our taxes there. And it loaded the update. And this is where we got unlucky, because Merck was pretty aggressive about patching overall. And so our SCCM software had visited the night before and dropped some updates on it. And so the credentials for SCCM, the service account, was still resident in memory. And that was how Mimikatz unlocked the kingdom, so to speak. And that was really what started the wildfire for us.
I've not heard that angle before, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and that was where, you mentioned our AD structure. The fact that our forest was so flat allowed it to spread so quickly. We learned a ton from that. Obviously, segmentation was one of the biggest things that came out of that. Just making sure that even our service accounts had, you talk about least privilege, but then sometimes products come in that require, what we call God level rights. And we're like, how can we break this piece apart so that if this were to happen again, maybe only a third of the population gets hit instead of everybody?
Right.
So we started looking hard in the mirror about, what decisions we could make to do that. So we did move to the tiering model that Microsoft recommended as part of that.
Yeah, how you go about limiting the scope of what your privileged accounts can do, so that if one of them gets compromised, right, it doesn't own everything.
Yeah,
which is very challenging to accomplish.
It is, and it's hard to talk to your stakeholders in that respect, because, the upside that we had was we had the actual reality of an attack to point to. But prior to that, as we were trying to roll out the privileged access program, that was harder for people to, like, this is going to be disruptive to us. And we're like, yeah, but it's going to be worth it because it's going to prevent an attack. Now, mild plug for my own efficacy with the PAM program, our privileged access vault was standing strong after the attack. Now, the Radius server that was in front of it was in flames, so nobody could get to it. But one of the things that helped us out tremendously was one of my engineers was able to drive to our data center, plug in a patch cable, and start issuing credentials. That was one of the reasons why AD was able to come up as fast as it was we had that capability. So it makes an interesting argument, and I'm still a bit of a curmudgeon in this space, that I really like having my privileged access platform on-prem for that reason. Because if you suffer from this kind of attack, you can't drive to Amazon East,
right,
and say, I need access to my server. They're going to go take a hike. You know?
Right.
Now, I know I'm losing that battle, but that was definitely a saving grace for us.
Sometimes there's no substitute for being able to put your hands on something.
Absolutely. And it's the challenge of the cloud, and I don't think it's going away, obviously. But I do think it creates some interesting decision-making of which assets gain you greater advantage by having the ability to lay hands on them.
risk acceptance.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Lance. I appreciate hearing. We all love to hear war stories from a safe distance, and this is certainly one of the great ones.
Well, I enjoy telling it. One of the things I didn't mention in my bio that I forgot is I teach at UNC Charlotte. And so one of the things I am able to do with all of these stories, including the recent CrowdStrike outage, which I'll be talking about on Monday with my class, the ability to share that with them so that, kind of in the shamanistic tradition of storytelling, in this case, it actually works. And they can at least have that perspective of, one of the things I teach them in all of my classes is don't be afraid to ask the question of what could go wrong. Because if you know or have a sense of that answer, then you know how you can respond to it. And that piece can make all the difference.
Everybody loves a good story, and this is one of the great ones. Thanks.
Unfortunately, I lived through it, but yes, thank you.
Thanks, Lance.
You bet.
Thanks for joining us on the Hybrid Identity Protection Podcast with Sean Deuby. Be sure to subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen. Visit hipconf.com, that's HIPCONF.com, to learn about upcoming events, view expert presentations, and take part in the conversation.